In a previous video on this kitchen remodel, we built and installed this second row of cabinets with glass doors to go on top of the existing cabinets. But there's still this back wall, which due to the slope of the ceiling, there just wasn't enough room to do. But the client still wanted to dress these up and continue the look of extending the cabinets up by boxing the space in and adding some trim details. This is also a really budget-friendly option as well. What we're doing in this video is a fraction of the cost compared to all the glass door cabinets. But I started by getting most of the materials prepped back in the shop, first chopping down all the 2x4 framing to rough size. And basically what I'm doing is building a bunch of small walls that will sit on top of each individual cabinet. Next, I ripped both edges off of the 2x4s to straighten them up and make each piece the same dimension at least, to make assembly a lot easier. From there, it's just getting all the pieces screwed together. Next, since the face frame of the existing cabinets is attached with staples and a thick bead of hot glue, I put a big round over on that bottom front edge so it wouldn't interfere and my framing could butt tight to the back of the face frame. The last bit of prep was ripping down the plywood and cross-cutting down close to final size. And I am using red oak plywood so the grain matches the existing cabinets, but if you were going for smooth, you would want to use either maple or birch plywood. Now to start getting these installed. Since the tops of these cabinets are like half-inch particle board, I elected to attach all my little walls by screwing up from the inside of the cabinet into my solid wood framing, which is way more secure. And like I said, I'm butting these tight to the back of the face frames, so then when I add the plywood, it's sitting directly on and flushes out with the front of the cabinet face frames. Once all my pre-assembled walls were attached, there were just a couple more I needed to measure for and get screwed together. Next, I could start getting it faced with the plywood, first scribing this one piece tight that butts into the wall. It's worth mentioning I did have to fix some of these existing cabinets to make sure they were nice and level before starting, to make all this more just plug and play. This is just a matter of that side drywall not being perfect, but just a little scribing and it looks like it is. To attach the plywood, I am gluing it to the 2x4s as well as all the corner joints to make it all one big solid piece. Up next is adding the crown molding to the top. Personally, I like to cut my crown in a nested position and then get some of the corners glued and clamped together down on the workbench where it's much easier. Since this is a shorter video and I always get questions on this, I wanted to go ahead and explain cutting the crown like this, as opposed to cutting it flat on the saw and doing compound cuts. Cutting it nested means holding the piece at the same spring angle that it gets installed when making the cut. This is simply done by holding the two flat parts on the back of the crown tight to the saw. The trick to this method is that you're actually cutting the piece upside down and backwards. So just envision this is how the crown is supposed to be installed, with the cove detail on the bottom. But to cut it, we're going to flip it over so the bottom is up along the fence. So here we're looking at our piece and need an outside miter on the right side. So we're going to flip that over and miter the saw to the left to make that cut. I really hope I simplified that enough. I know it sounds confusing, but with a little practice, it becomes second nature, and I just find it easier and way more efficient than laying the crown down flat and having to change both the miter and bevel the saw head for each cut. It's no big deal to just hold the crown like I showed, but here you can see I have a jig on my saw so I can just plop the piece down and it's held at the same angle every time. But the same thing can be done with just some scrap pieces of wood taped and glued down to the saw as stops. Up next is this little 3/4 inch molding right on the seam between the plywood and cabinets. And notice I did go ahead and sand the top of the existing cabinets real quick so I wouldn't have to worry about sanding tight to this molding later on. At this point it looks good and could be done like this, besides paint of course, but we are adding one more detail right in the middle with this base cap molding. Just another layer of detail, and it's the same molding that I used on their kitchen island build as well, so it ties it all together. Now for this first coat of primer, I'm using a roller and brush to really work it into the open grain of the oak. The client liked and wanted the wood grain, but this takes care of those really deep and black voids. If you've painted oak, you know what I'm talking about. And since applying white top coat on top of white primer makes for really boring video, figured I'd throw in priming some of the doors instead, since that's a little more satisfying. But that's it, a really simple and affordable project to really dress up your cabinets. Make sure you check out the other videos from this kitchen if you haven't already, and make sure you're subscribed for future projects. Thanks for watching.